Have you ever looked at a country and, wondered how it transformed from this traditional agricultural society into a modern digital powerhouse in, well, basically a single lifetime?
Right. It's a massive shift.
And I mean, you have to wonder what hidden costs were paid along the way, because if you just look at the surface, you see the gleaming cities, the smartphones, these surging agricultural
Yeah, the
exports.
postcard version of the country.
Exactly. But when you apply a really ruthless, unforgiving accounting standard to like the environmental and structural costs, that entire narrative of progress just it kind of fractures.
It really does.
So today we're looking at what I think is the ultimate paradox of global development.
And that paradox is exactly why the source material for today is so incredibly crucial. We're pulling apart this comprehensive 15-page academic evaluation,
Right.
and it's based on over 60 years of World Bank multidimensional data. So we're tracking from 1960 all the way to 2023.
Which is a huge chunk of time.
It is. It gives us this rare, God's eye view of Brazil's developmental trajectory. It's not just a snapshot.
Yeah, it's a half-century autopsy, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It forces us to look past the standard GDP metrics and actually measure what makes a society thrive or stumble. We're looking at economic structure, these ticking demographic clocks, invisible environmental invoices, and institutional friction.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our mission for this deep dive is to extract that definitive story of their half-century transformation. We're framing Brazil not just as a country, but as this massive real-world laboratory for global development.
I like that framing.
Yeah, we're going to decode the economic miracles, the sudden corrections, and this massive digital leap forward. But to understand any of that, I think we have to start with the most visible metric of a country's success, right? Its economic heartbeat.
Great. Before we look at the structural organs driving it, we need to look at the baseline growth.
Yeah.
And if you look at the macroeconomic baseline starting in the 1960s, the immediate anomaly that just it completely dominates the charts is the 1970s.
Oh, yeah.
Economists usually refer to this as the Brazilian miracle, and the World Bank data completely backs that up. We see GDP growth rates repeatedly smashing past the 10% mark.
Okay, wait, I want to contextualize a 10% growth rate for a second for you listening, because it's easy to hear that number and just, move on.
Yeah, it sounds like just a good year on paper.
Right. But 10% annual growth doesn't just mean local businesses are doing well. It means a violent reorganization of society. It means millions of people migrating from rural agrarian lives into these rapidly expanding urban centers.
Massive state-led infrastructure.
Exactly. But my question is about the structural integrity of that growth. Like, was that 10% driven by actual, technological innovation and high-level productivity? Or was it just this brute force mobilization of cheap labor into basic factories?
The data strongly points to the latter. It was extensive growth, not intensive growth.
Okay, break that down.
Sure. So extensive growth basically relies on just adding more inputs.
Yeah.
More land, more capital, more low-skilled labor. When you take a farmer and put them in a basic manufacturing job, you get this immediate massive spike in economic output.
Right, because they're suddenly producing manufactured goods instead of just subsistence farming.
Exactly. But that spike is a one-time trick. You aren't creating new technologies or highly efficient institutional frameworks. You're just catching up.
Ah, I see.
And the charts show the brutal reality of what happens when that extensive growth model just exhausts itself. The euphoria of the 70s plunges directly into the negative growth of the 1980s.
The lost decade.
Yes, the 1980s are universally known there as the lost decade. It was defined by severe negative growth, sovereign debt crises, and hyperinflation.
Which is wild. And this wasn't an isolated cycle either. The data shows this wave-like pattern just continuing. If we track per capita GDP, which I love because it strips away the noise of population growth.
Yeah, it shows you the actual economic footprint of the average citizen.
Right, so the volatility there is stark. In 1960, per capita GDP sits around $2,600. It climbs steadily, rides these global waves, and peaks at $9,366 in 2011. And that's measured in constant 2015 dollars.
That 2011 peak is really important.
Yeah, but then around 2015, the charts show this violent pullback. The economy doesn't just slow down, it actively contracts. So what does this all mean for their current economy?
Well, that 2015 contraction is basically the manifestation of the middle income trap. It's
Yeah.
really the defining macroeconomic diagnosis of this entire 60-year
And
evaluation.
the middle income trap.
Yeah. It's relatively easy to grow from low to middle income by mobilizing cheap labor, like we talked about, but it is incredibly hard to transition to a high-income, high-productivity economy.
I always think of it like a startup, you know? It's like a startup that scales massively on easy venture capital, or in this case, raw industrialization and global conditions, but then suddenly hits a wall when it actually needs to turn a sustainable profit based on its own innovation.
That's a perfect analogy. You get too expensive for cheap manufacturing, but you haven't acquired the technological capacity to compete with advanced economies in those high-value sectors.
But wait, I want to challenge that inevitability a bit. Doesn't this ignore the role of global commodity cycles? Because when I look at that 2011 peak of over $9,000, that aligns perfectly with the global commodity supercycle.
Oh, absolutely.
Like China was buying up every ton of iron ore and every bushel of soybeans they could find. So wasn't Brazil's growth in that period just the trap being temporarily camouflaged by a massive influx of foreign cash?
Yes, 100%. The commodity supercycle created an illusion of structural progress. It inflated their currency, which boosted purchasing power temporarily, but it actually made the underlying vulnerability worse.
Because they were too reliant on raw exports.
Exactly. When global commodity prices collapsed around 2014, the camouflage vanished. By 2015, the global cycle dictated the local reality, and they didn't have a resilient tech or manufacturing sector to fall back on.
Which means we really need to look under the hood of this economy. If the overall growth is a roller coaster, what is actually driving the cart? How did the engine change from 1960 to today?
What's fascinating here is the massive structural shift the data reveals. When you look at the stacking area chart detailing GDP contributions, the visual is actually quite jarring. The service sector has systematically swallowed the rest of the economy.
Swallowed it.
Yeah. In the 1990s, services accounted for roughly 50% of GDP. Today, the models estimate that services represent nearly 70% of the entire economy.
Okay, but a 70% service economy is what you'd expect to see in the US or
Yeah.
the UK, right? That sounds like a developed nation.
On paper, yes.
Yeah.
But the crucial context here is the collapse of the industrial sector. In the 1980s, industry accounted for over 40% of Brazil's GDP. That was the era of heavy manufacturing, building a middle class through factory jobs.
Right.
Today, that industrial share has shrunk to under 20%. This is what economists call premature deindustrialization.
Premature, meaning they lost the factories before they got rich.
Exactly. Losing industrial capacity before becoming a high-income nation is a massive red flag for long-term global competitiveness. For an advanced economy, shifting to services means high-value stuff, global finance, software architecture.
But if you haven't built a workforce that's writing enterprise software, what exactly does a 70% service sector look like?
It looks like low productivity, informal labor, street vendors, domestic workers, basic retail, gig economy logistics. These services don't generate export revenue or drive technological innovation.
Wow. So it's a bloated, informal economy compensating for a hollowed-out industrial core.
That's exactly what the data shows.
That makes the agricultural data even more of a paradox. Because when you think of Brazil on the global stage, you think of massive agribusiness. Soybeans, beef, the Amazon.
Right, the agricultural paradox. The divergence between agriculture's domestic footprint and its international weight is immense.
Because agriculturally, they're a powerhouse.
Internationally, yes. But domestically, agriculture represents a surprisingly small and shrinking percentage of GDP and employment. It's highly mechanized now, so it doesn't employ the masses like it used to.
But yet, it remains the absolute backbone of their export and energy contributions.
Exactly. It drives their trade surplus. And speaking of trade, the dynamics there are really interesting. In the early 2000s, they had a massive trade surplus. But the strategic shift in export destinations is what you need to look at.
They shifted away from the West, right?
Yeah, a massive pivot toward low and middle income countries, particularly within Latin America. They are embedding themselves as a complex player in the global South, not just a supplier to the US or Europe.
But if you're still exporting raw soybeans, does it really matter if the ship sails to Europe or another emerging market? You're still trapped at the bottom of the value chain?
It changes their geopolitical leverage, but you're right, it deepens their trade dependence on commodities. The underlying vulnerability hasn't been solved.
Okay, so we've seen the economic growth, the roller coaster, the structural shifts. But standard GDP is basically just a gross revenue number.
Right, it just measures volume.
Here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when we look at the actual profit of the nation after paying the environmental bills? Because standard accounting treats liquidating natural capital as income.
And that is the fundamental flaw the report addresses by introducing adjusted net savings, or ANS. This is a game-changer metric.
Yeah, break down ANS for us.
ANS takes traditional national savings, what a country produces, minus what it consumes, and it subtracts the costs of natural resource depletion.
Like minerals, energy, forests.
Exactly. And it also subtracts pollution damages, specifically carbon dioxide and particulate emissions. It treats natural resources not as free gifts, but as capital assets that are being liquidated.
But wait, a classic economist might say, hey, if a country chops down a forest to sell the timber, traditional GDP says they got richer, and if they use that money to build a university, that's fine. Is traditional economic tracking just a vanity metric?
Well, the World Bank isn't arguing against resource conversion inherently. What ANS points out is that if you chop down the forest and just consume the profits without investing in human or physical capital, you are mathematically destroying your own national wealth.
You're liquidating a core asset.
Right. And the stark data here reveals that in multiple years, Brazil's adjusted net savings dipped into the negative.
Negative.
Negative, meaning the development model is mathematically unsustainable.
It's like, okay, picture a family. It's like a family selling off the copper wiring inside the walls of their house just to buy groceries for the week.
That is a brutally accurate analogy.
Right, because if you look at their bank account that week, GDP says, hey, your income went up, you have food. But ANS points out that you just destroyed the foundation of your house to simulate growth.
Exactly. And the CSV files accompanying this report show billions of dollars in carbon dioxide damage and particulate emission damage, systematically erasing traditional financial gains. Billions.
Yeah.
Around 2022, energy consumption and natural resource depletion took a particularly massive bite out of their gross national income. The traditional metrics celebrated growth, but ANS exposed this massive hidden invoice.
That is staggering. And it brings us to a huge point. A country's economy, its environment, all of this is ultimately managed by its people, but the profile of the average Brazilian has completely transformed, hasn't it?
Oh, fundamentally, we're looking at a ticking demographic clock.
If you picture a seesaw, you can really visualize this demographic shift. On one side, you have the children. On the other side, you have the elderly. And the data shows how violently that seesaw has tipped since 2010.
Violently is the right word. In 1960, the population pyramid was heavily skewed young. Children aged 0 to 14 made up 44% of the population.
Really half the country.
But by 2020, that dropped to roughly 20%. The base of the pyramid just hollowed out. Meanwhile, the 65 and older demographic exploded from 2.5% to over 10%.
So the old age dependency ratio just skyrockets.
Yes, it entered a rapid, aggressive acceleration phase right after 2010. What we are seeing is the closing of the demographic dividend.
Right, the era of having a massive, cheap, young labor force to support just a few retirees, that's over.
It's completely over. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it means their Social Security and pension systems are about to face crushing, unprecedented pressure.
Because they're aging before they escape the middle income trap. They're getting old before they get rich.
Exactly. So if you have fewer young workers, each one must be highly educated and hyperproductive to support this aging society. Which brings us to the education data.
Right. And the education data is kind of a mixed bag, isn't it?
It is. At the foundational level, it's a massive success. Youth literacy has hit nearly 100%. The gender gap in basic literacy is gone. Primary and high school completion rates are soaring.
But higher education.
Yeah, higher education quality and coverage remain a stubborn bottleneck. And if higher ed is lagging, Brazil faces a critical skills mismatch. You can't transition to a high-productivity economy without university-educated engineers and advanced researchers.
So you have a shrinking workforce that isn't getting the advanced education they need to pay for the aging population's pensions.
That's the crisis in a nutshell.
And with this education bottleneck and aging population, how are the fruits of this society actually being distributed? Because we have to talk about the divides: inequality, gender, health.
Let's start with wealth inequality, because the concentration of wealth here is globally extreme. The top 20% of earners command over 50% of the nation's wealth.
Wow.
While the bottom 20% hold a mere 3%.
So imagine a room with 5 people representing the country. One person in that room holds more than half of all the wealth, and the poorest person basically has nothing.
Exactly. And despite some drops in absolute poverty over the decades thanks to social programs, that extreme wealth concentration at the top remains virtually immovable.
And what about the gender data? Because that tells a really interesting story of legal versus cultural reality.
It does. The Women's Business and Law Index shows a heroic leap. In 1970, Brazil scored a 31.25.
Which is dismal.
Right. But in recent years, they've hit a perfect score of 100.
Okay, but here's my pushback on that paradox of progress. A score of 100 means the laws are perfectly equal on paper, right? But the boardroom and parliament data doesn't reflect that at all.
Not even close. Women remain drastically underrepresented in parliament and executive boardrooms.
So why does the culture lag so far behind the law?
Because passing a law doesn't erase decades of historical capital accumulation or informal male-dominated networks. The law is perfect on paper, but the cultural and institutional inertia is immense.
Which artificially limits the leadership potential of half your population during a demographic crisis. You just can't afford that.
No, you really can't. And this ties directly into public health, because the health data shows overall life expectancy has surged, with women significantly outliving men, by the way, but the cause of death has fundamentally shifted.
It's the non-communicable diseases, right? NCDs.
Yes, over 70% of deaths are now caused by NCDs, like cancer and cardiovascular disease.
So when you synthesize that health data with the demographic data we just talked about, a population that's living longer combined with a 70% NCD rate means chronic illness management.
Exactly.
And managing chronic illness takes decades of resources. That will bankrupt the healthcare system if it isn't reformed, right?
It's a massive fiscal time bomb.
So how does a government actually manage all of this? Extreme inequality, an aging population, environmental pressure. Let's look at their governance and their infrastructure.
The report uses the World Governance Indicators, or WGI, and it shows Brazil has relative strength in voice and accountability.
Meaning mature democratic mechanisms. People can vote, there's free speech.
Right. However, they face systemic bottlenecks in two other areas: control of corruption, which has fluctuated and recently dropped in percentile rankings, and government effectiveness.
And just a quick note to you listening, we are maintaining strict neutrality here. We are simply reporting what the World Bank WGI metrics state. We're not taking political sides or commenting on specific parties. We're just looking at the structural data.
Exactly. The data just shows a systemic struggle with bureaucratic efficiency.
But this raises an important question for me. Because if you have a country with struggling government efficiency, how on earth do they execute such a flawless leap into the digital age?
It's the most optimistic dynamic in the report. The digital explosion is incredible. Mobile cellular subscriptions experienced exponential growth. Around 2010, they actually surpassed the total population.
Wait, really? Over 100 subscriptions per 100 people?
Over 100 per 100 people. And secure internet servers and ICT services, information and communication tech have just skyrocketed.
So how does this struggling bureaucracy build a world-class digital network?
Because private digital infrastructure is unencumbered. When private capital builds telecom towers and fiber optics, it leapfrogs traditional physical hurdles. You don't need a decade of bureaucratic permitting to put a smartphone in someone's hand.
Oh, wow. So the digital connectivity is basically a workaround. It's reshaping society and becoming the new frontier for their service-based trade, totally bypassing the government bottlenecks.
Precisely. It shows that development can leapfrog traditional hurdles when the technology allows it.
That is fascinating. But to fund this digital future and to manage those massive legacy debts we talked about, how does Brazil interact with global finance and the global climate agenda? Let's get into our final section here.
From a financial perspective, we have to track their journey from the 1980s and 90s. Back then, they were highly vulnerable to debt crises. But post-2000, they stabilized their gross national income debt ratio.
So they evolved.
They did. They evolved from an aid-dependent nation to a really complex player in international financial markets.
But what about their energy and environment profile? Because this seems to be where they are fighting themselves on two different fronts.
It's a stark duality. On one hand, Brazil is a global titan in renewable electricity generation. Their power grid is an absolute envy of the green world. Massive hydroelectric, wind, and solar.
Right, but electricity isn't everything.
Exactly. When you look at overall energy consumption, which includes heavy industry and transportation, over 50% still relies on fossil fuels.
And even that isn't their Achilles heel, is it? It's the land use.
Land use changes, specifically deforestation. It is the massive turning point for their greenhouse gas emissions.
So you have this amazing green power grid on one side, but on the other hand, cutting down the Amazon and the savannas completely erases those gains. It's actively blocking their environmental targets.
It's a profound internal contradiction. It's not just a simple polluter versus green narrative.
Hmm.
It's an agricultural export model that demands land clearing to fund the macroeconomy, directly conflicting with the survival of the biosphere.
Man, it's just the complexity is staggering. They're literally fighting themselves on two different environmental fronts. Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's pull all these threads together to summarize this Brazilian trajectory.
When you synthesize the report, you have to weigh the grand achievements against the massive bottlenecks.
Right. The achievements are real. Industrial diversification, universal basic education, legal gender equality, this incredible digital leapfrogging, and a renewable energy grid.
But those are weighed down by falling industrial competitiveness, extreme wealth concentration, a rapidly aging population, and deforestation.
So based on the report's conclusion, what is the path forward?
The report lays out three strategic necessities,
Okay.
three pillars. First is reform, deepening institutional efficiency and escaping that middle income trap.
Second is equity, bridging the social and educational divides because an aging society needs every citizen to be productive.
And third is sustainability,
Hmm.
protecting the ecological shield because you can't just keep selling the copper wiring to buy groceries.
You really can't. And that actually leaves me with a new angle to ponder, something I want to leave you, the listener, with today. We've spent this time talking about how traditional GDP hides the cost of a country's natural resources. But it makes you wonder, what adjusted net savings are we ignoring in our own lives?
That's a profound way to look at it.
Right. Like, are we celebrating our own personal or corporate growth, hitting our targets, increasing our income, while secretly depleting our internal forests? Are we burning out our health, our time, our relationships, just to show a superficial profit on the surface? It's something to think about.
The math always catches up eventually.
It always does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really believe in the value of looking past the headlines and into the actual data. We'll see you next time.